Welcome to the Israel Illuminated channel. Today we will examine the topic, why did God hate Esau? Understanding Edom, the covenant, and the choice between flesh and spirit. One of the most misunderstood statements in all of Scripture is God's declaration, Jacob I loved, but Esau I hated, revealed in Malachi 1:2-3 and Romans 9:13. At first glance, these words appear harsh, leading some to conclude that God arbitrarily loved one brother while emotionally despising the other. Yet when these passages are studied within their biblical context, an entirely different picture emerges. The issue is not divine favoritism or human emotion, but God's sovereign choice of the covenant line through which he would accomplish his redemptive purposes. The Bible consistently teaches that God chose Jacob, later renamed Israel, to inherit the covenant promises given first to Abraham and then to Isaac. Esau, though greatly blessed in many earthly ways, rejected those covenant privileges and ultimately became the father of the nation of Edom. Isaac and Rebekah had twin sons, Esau and Jacob. Before they were born, God declared, "Two nations are in your womb, and two peoples shall be separated from your body. One people shall be stronger than the other, and the older shall serve the younger." Written in Genesis 25:23. From the beginning, God revealed that these twins represented far more than two individuals. They symbolized two nations, two destinies, and ultimately two spiritual paths. Jacob would become the father of Israel, the covenant nation through whom the Messiah would come. Esau would become Edom, a nation repeatedly characterized throughout Scripture by pride, violence, and hostility toward God's covenant people of Israel. Genesis chapter 36 shows that Esau's descendants became chiefs, kings, and a prosperous nation long before Israel established its monarchy. God blessed Esau materially, but he did not choose him to carry the covenant through which the Messiah would come. Throughout Scripture, God repeatedly chooses one individual over another to fulfill his purposes. He chose Abraham from among all the nations, Isaac instead of Ishmael, Jacob instead of Esau, David instead of his older brothers, and Judah instead of Reuben as the royal tribe. Romans chapter 9 makes clear that God's choice of Jacob was part of his sovereign plan rather than a response to human merit. Next, we will analyze Esau's rejection of the covenant and birthright. Although God's sovereign election preceded the twins' birth, Esau's own life demonstrated why he became a fitting picture of those who reject God's promises. The defining moment came when Esau returned from hunting exhausted and demanded food from Jacob, but Jacob demanded his birthright in return. Esau foolishly agreed. Then Jacob gave Esau bread and lentil stew, and he ate and drank, arose and went his way. Thus Esau despised his birthright. Shown in Genesis 25:34. The birthright represented far more than additional inheritance. It carried the covenant promises first given to Abraham, the covenant relationship with God, the promised land of Israel, the coming Messiah, and the blessing that all nations would ultimately receive through Abraham's descendants. Esau exchanged all of this for a single meal. Esau preferred immediate gratification over eternal inheritance. He chose appetite over covenant. The book of Hebrews later warns believers, "See that no one is unholy like Esau, who sold his birthright for a single meal. For afterward, when he desired to inherit the blessing, he was rejected." Shown in Hebrews 12:16-17. Esau therefore becomes a warning to every generation not to exchange eternal treasures for temporary pleasures. Next, we will examine the character of Esau throughout his life. To begin with, he clearly despised his birthright. He married pagan wives who grieved Isaac and Rebekah, written in Genesis 26:34-35 and 28:8-9. Isaac prophesied concerning him, "By your sword you shall live." shown in Genesis 27:40, showing that Esau was a man of war. Esau hated Jacob and plotted to murder him after Jacob received the blessing, shown in Genesis 27:41. His descendants, later called the Edomites, opposed Israel repeatedly. When Moses led Israel from Egypt toward the promised land of Israel, Edom refused Israel passage. "You shall not pass through, lest I come out against you with the sword," written in Numbers 20:18. Esau's grandson Amalek later became the ancestor of Israel's continual enemy, shown in Genesis 36:12, prompting God's declaration, "The Lord will have war with Amalek from generation to generation," revealed in Exodus 17:16. Because of this long history of violence and hostility, Edom eventually became a biblical symbol of rebellion against God's covenant purposes and people. For this reason, many Bible teachers view anti-Semitism and forms of anti-Zionism that are rooted in hostility toward the Jewish people and their national restoration as reflecting the same rebellious spirit that Scripture associates with Edom. Throughout history, anti-Semitism has appeared in many cultures and political systems, long after the ancient nation of Edom disappeared. While its forms have changed, its underlying hostility towards the Jewish people has remained tragically persistent, just as the prophets predicted. Unlike Esau, Jacob clung to God's promises despite years of hardship. The everlasting covenant was later reaffirmed. Remember his covenant forever, the covenant which he made with Abraham and confirmed to Jacob, saying, "To you I will give the land of Canaan as your allotted inheritance," written in 1 Chronicles 16:15-18. Jacob ultimately represents the life of faith that treasures God's promises above immediate gratification. The contrast between Jacob and Esau extends beyond history into spiritual application. In many respects, Esau illustrates the works of the flesh, pride, self-will, violence, impulsiveness, and worldly desire and the hatred of Israel. Jacob, despite his imperfections, grows into a picture of humility, perseverance, faith, and covenant dependence. The choice between Jacob and Esau therefore becomes the choice every believer must make daily. Will we live according to the flesh or according to the Spirit? But why does God say he hated Esau in Malachi 1:2-3? This is even centuries after Jacob and Esau had already died. His words are not focused solely on the two brothers as individuals. Rather, Malachi is speaking of the two nations that descended from them, Israel, the descendants of Jacob, and Edom, the descendants of Esau. Understanding this historical and covenantal context is essential for interpreting the passage correctly. God rejected Esau's way of life because it represented contempt for holiness, covenant, and obedience. Esau possessed every opportunity to inherit God's promises, but valued temporary satisfaction more than eternal blessing. As Israel's history unfolds, Edom increasingly becomes a prophetic symbol of nations and powers that oppose God's covenant people. The prophets repeatedly pronounce judgment against Edom. Ezekiel declares, "Because you have had an ancient hatred and have shed the blood of the children of Israel, therefore blood shall pursue you," written in Ezekiel 35:5-6. Obadiah announces, "The house of Jacob shall be a fire, but the house of Esau shall be stubble," shown in Obadiah 18. Isaiah likewise speaks of God's judgment against Edom. "For it is the day of the Lord's vengeance, the year of recompense for the cause of Zion," shown in Isaiah 34:8. These passages reflect God's judgment upon Edom because of its continual violence toward Israel. But why do many Jewish writers identify Edom with Rome or Christians? An important historical development occurred after the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 AD. and the Bar Kokhba revolt in 132 to 135 AD, rabbinic literature increasingly began using Edom as a symbolic name for Rome. Several factors contributed to this association. Rome had become Israel's great political oppressor. Herod the Great, who ruled Judea under Roman authority, was an Idumean descended from Edom. The ancient rivalry between Jacob and Esau seemed to mirror Israel's struggle against the Roman Empire. When Emperor Constantine later embraced Christianity and the Roman Empire became officially Christian, many Jewish interpreters extended the symbolic identification from pagan Rome to Christian Rome. Over centuries of expulsions, forced conversions, inquisitions, blood libels, restrictions, and massacres during the Crusades, many Jewish communities came to experience Christian governments as their persecutors. Consequently, biblical prophecies concerning Edom were reread through that historical experience. It is important, however, to recognize that this identification represents one stream within Jewish interpretation rather than a universally accepted doctrine. Likewise, most Christians reject the idea that the church is literally descended from Esau or constitutes Edom. Christianity itself began entirely within Judaism. Yeshua, his apostles, and the earliest believers were all Jewish. The New Testament teaches that believing Gentiles are grafted into Israel's covenantal blessings through faith in the Messiah, rather than replacing Israel or becoming descendants of Esau, shown in Romans 11:17-24. Although Edom was a historical nation, the story of Esau continues to speak to every generation. Every believer faces the same fundamental decision. Will we value God's covenant above temporary pleasure? Will we pursue humility rather than pride? Will we seek reconciliation instead of violence? Will we treasure Israel's eternal inheritance? While many Jewish people think Christians represent Edom, believers in Yeshua are commanded not to emulate Esau's ways. Hebrews clearly warns believers not to become godless like Esau, shown in Hebrews 12:16. The warning is spiritual rather than ethnic. Esau's greatest failure was not his ancestry but his contempt for what God considered holy. Jacob, despite all his weaknesses, kept returning to God's promises until he was transformed. The prophets unanimously declare that God's covenant purposes with Israel will ultimately prevail. Obadiah concludes with these triumphant words, "Deliverers shall come to Mount Zion to judge the mountains of Esau, and the kingdom shall be the Lord's." Written in Obadiah chapter 21. Daniel likewise foresees the kingdoms of this world falling before the everlasting kingdom established by God. A stone was cut out without hands. It struck the image and became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. Revealed in Daniel 2:34-35. Ultimately, the conflict between Jacob and Esau reaches its fulfillment in the reign of the Messiah. The kingdoms built upon pride, violence, and human power will pass away, but God's covenant kingdom will endure forever. The story of Jacob and Esau is therefore not merely ancient history. It is a mirror held before every generation. One path follows the flesh, valuing appetite, power, money, anti-Semitism, and immediate gratification. The other follows the Spirit, embracing covenant, faith, humility, and God's eternal promises. Each person must choose which path to walk. So which path will you choose? Jacob's covenantal path, or Esau's path of rejection of the birthright and of Israel? Scripture consistently calls us to reject the spirit of Esau and to embrace the faith of Jacob. For those who are of faith are blessed with believing Abraham, shown in Galatians 3:9. In the end, as the prophets declare, the kingdom shall be the Lord's. Thank you for watching the Israel Illuminated channel. If you like our channel, please like and subscribe, and we'll see you on the next one.